It began on a winter night so bitter that the candles in the great hall burned with blue flames, their wax cracking in the cold. The palace of Madrid lay silent beneath a sky the color of hammered iron. Servants whispered that the silence itself felt heavy, as if the stones of the Escorial were holding their breath. Somewhere in that labyrinth of marble and shadow, a father was about to destroy his son. The corridor outside the prince's bedchamber had been cleared. Tapestries hung stiff with frost, their woven saints and martyrs staring down with glassy eyes. From far away came the echo of armored boots. Slow, deliberate, inevitable. King Philip II was not dressed for court. He was clad from head to toe in black Milanese plate, each rivet glinting like a frozen tear. This was not the attire of a father come to reason with his heir. This was the armor of a general marching into enemy territory. When he reached the heavy oak door, Philip did not wait for it to be opened. He struck it himself, 3 thunderous blows with his gauntleted fist, and the iron hinges shrieked. The wood splintered inward, revealing the chamber lit only by a single dying fire. Prince Don Carlos woke to the sound of steel. For one heartbeat, he was still half dreaming. The warmth of his bed, the pale winter light spilling through the shutters. Then he saw the shadows of armed guards flooding his room. At their head his father, visor lowered, face hidden in cold metal. Carlos sat up, confusion giving way to horror. This was no lecture, no scolding, no royal formality. This was an arrest. The man who had given him life had come to take his freedom. Later, courtiers would speak of that moment in hushed tones. How the boy's face changed. How the tremor in his voice stilled into a strange, brittle calm. In that instant, the bond of blood between them snapped like a bowstring. The betrayal would echo through the courts of Europe and through the centuries. But to understand how a king could march against his only son, one must return to the beginning, to a birth hailed as a miracle, yet whispered to be a curse. The year was 1545. Spain was the beating heart of an empire that stretched across oceans, and the Habsburg bloodline was its most precious possession. Within the royal palace, courtiers murmured in anticipation. The queen was in labor. But behind closed doors, the royal physicians spoke in low, grave tones. They knew what others did not. This child's family tree was not a tree at all. It was a circle tightening upon itself. 6 great-great-grandparents instead of 16. Generations of uncles wedding, nieces, cousins, marrying cousins, all to keep the blood pure. It was purity in name only. A perfection so obsessed with itself it had become poison. On the night before the birth, an old court astrologer, a man tolerated for his discretion rather than trusted for his wisdom, was summoned to cast the child's horoscope. He studied the stars and paled. Born beneath the tail of the dying star, he murmured, "The child will be the hunger that devours its own throne." The words were dismissed as superstition, but not forgotten. On July 8, 1545, Prince Don Carlos came into the world. The midwives exchanged uneasy glances, the skull misshapen, the cries weaker than they should be. But he was alive and he was male, enough to set the palace bells ringing in jubilation. His mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, only 17, held him once. The birth had torn her body beyond repair. Fever took hold within hours. For 4 days she lingered, praying in her native Portuguese, while her ladies pressed cold cloths to her burning skin. On the 5th day, the same bells that had proclaimed her son's birth tolled for her funeral. And here the curse tightened its coil. For Maria was not only Carlos's mother, but also his first cousin. Their fathers were brothers, their mothers were sisters. It was a marriage made in the echo chamber of blood. And now that same blood carried the seeds of decay into the newborn's veins. From infancy, the signs were there. Fits that left him silent and rigid, breathless for nearly a minute before gasping back to life. Fevers that painted his cheeks scarlet, yet the court celebrated him still, draping his cradle in brocade, swaddling him in silk as if wealth could hide fragility. Some whispered of omens, that on the night of his christening, a tapestry fell from the chapel wall without wind. That in the nursery, a candle flame once flared blue before guttering out on its own. As he grew, the boy's body began to tell the truth. The royal scribes would not. The ribcage too narrow for his lungs, the left, Legs shorter than the right, the skull swelling unevenly like fruit left too long in the sun. Portraits were painted from carefully chosen angles, the deformities masked in shadow, but shadows cannot hold forever. By the time Don Carlos reached adolescence, the whisper of a curse had become something no court painter could disguise. The years had not been kind. His chest remained sunken, forcing each breath to sound like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Left leg lagged inches behind the right, creating a lurching gait that mocked the dignity of his station. When the royal armorer tried to craft a breastplate for the young heir, the steel would not fit. His rib cage refused to expand enough for comfort. The armorer sweated under the king's gaze, filing, hammering, reshaping, all in vain. The truth was too stubborn for even Milani's craftsmanship. To mask deformity with discipline, the court physicians prescribed corrective treatments. They called them remedies. To Carlos, they were daily crucifixions. Iron boots to stretch the shorter leg until the flesh bruised purple. Baths laced with mercury to straighten the spine, leaving his skin smelling of metal for days. Repeated bleedings to balance his humors, the warm trickle of life running into silver bowls. Servants told stories in the kitchens, stories they never repeated above a whisper. Of how the prince, after an especially painful session, would stalk the corridors in silence, his eyes fever-bright, lips curled as if savoring some secret vengeance. It was during this time that the first rumors emerged of the Cabinet of Horrors, hidden in a locked wing of the palace accessible only to Carlos and a mute servant boy it was said to contain. Jars of small floating corpses, songbirds with necks bent backward, a snake coiled in two, an impossible not even what one terrified page swore was a human finger wrapped in lace. Beside them sat velvet boxes filled with teeth, each labeled in the prince's own hand. No one knew if these were trophies or tools for some private ritual. Whether truth or invention, the rumor gained weight when a visiting alchemist, a gaunt man from Antwerp, was summoned to the prince's chambers. He stayed 3 nights, emerging only to request candles, mirrors, and blood, fresh from a creature of warm breath. On the 4th morning, the alchemist was gone, leaving behind a scorched silver basin and the lingering stench of burned hair. The prince's moods were mercurial. On good days, he could recite courtly verse with the eloquence expected of a Habsburg heir, but on others, his speech tangled, the words thick on his tongue, as if his own mouth betrayed him. And then came the headaches, crushing storms that drove him to darkness for days. Servants swore they heard him pounding his head against the stone walls, trying to beat the pain out with greater pain. After one such episode, a chambermaid fled in tears, claiming she had found him sitting in the dark, speaking to a figure only he could see. When she dared to ask who was there, he smiled faintly. "My mother," he said, "and she's come for me at last." But the cruelties of his body were matched, some said eclipsed, by the cruelties of his mind. The infamous shoemaker incident was only the beginning. One winter afternoon, a craftsman was brought in with new boots designed to ease Carlos's lopsided gait. The left boot pinched. Carlos, with an eerie calm, ordered the man to eat them. At first the shoemaker laughed, thinking it a jest. Then the prince repeated himself, voice colder. Guards seized the man, forcing leather between his teeth until he gagged. Carlos watched without blinking. In the weeks that followed, new tales reached the servants' quarters. Of rabbits roasted alive over the prince's fireplace, timed to measure how long the screaming would last. Of a hawk, once the pride of the royal aviary, found with its wings torn away, its eyes replaced by black beads. The king's advisors whispered that this was not merely a sickly boy's temper, it was something darker. Yet in public, all was ceremony and polish. Carlos was still presented to visiting dignitaries. Though foreign ambassadors sent coded reports home, the heir's constitution appears delicate. None dared write the truth, that the heir to the most powerful throne in Christendom looked at times like a broken thing reassembled without care, like a porcelain figure glued back together by a blind craftsman. And beneath the grandeur of court banquets and processions, the prince nursed his private empire of shadows. In the dark corners of his mind and of the palace he was already plotting, though no one yet knew the target. When Elizabeth of Valois arrived at the Spanish court, she brought with her the perfume of France, roses, musk, and something intangible. a lightness the stone halls of Madrid had not known in years. She was meant to be Carlos's bride, a match that would unite two kingdoms and perhaps, the court hoped, temper the prince's restless nature. But the king had other plans. Philip, recently widowed, decided that Spain needed a queen sooner than his son needed a wife. The announcement that he would marry Elizabeth himself struck the court like a thunderclap. For Carlos, it was more than a political maneuver. It was a theft. His father had stolen not just a bride, but a future, a place in the world. Perhaps the only soft light in his otherwise dark existence. The wedding day was a slow-burning torture. Dressed in garments tailored to conceal his deformities, Carlos stood among the courtiers as Elizabeth, radiant in white and gold, took vows with his father. Every smile they shared was a blade. Every brush of Philip's hand against hers was salt in a wound that could never heal. From that day, Carlos's gaze upon Elizabeth changed. Where once there might have been admiration, now there was something more dangerous. A possessive, burning hunger. He began leaving tokens outside her chamber, black roses whose thorns still glistened red, locks of his own hair braided into strange, knotted patterns. One rumor spoke of a letter discovered centuries later in a locked drawer of Elizabeth's writing desk. It was written in halting French, riddled with errors, the script veering from delicate to violently slashed. Half was a confession of love, the other half a string of threats, promises of what he would do if she continued to deny him. Elizabeth never spoke publicly of these advances. She played the role of the serene queen, smiling at ceremonies, speaking with grace. But her ladies-in-waiting told another story, of locks fitted quietly to her doors, of whispered prayers before bed, of scratching sounds in the corridor at night when the guards were elsewhere. Carlos's humiliation festered into obsession, and obsession into performance. At a court masque celebrating a diplomatic treaty, guests were startled when the prince strode into the great hall unannounced. He wore a crown woven from dead ivy, the leaves brittle and gray, and recited lines from an old tragedy about a king who murdered his own son. His eyes never left his father's face. Philip's expression did not change, but his knuckles whitened around the armrest of his chair. Behind the scenes, the prince's temper became more unpredictable. In one incident, a young maid glimpsed him without his specially crafted shoes, revealing his twisted foot. Her involuntary gasp sparked a chase through the narrow service corridors. Carlos's uneven gait turned the pursuit into a grotesque dance, lunging, stumbling, clawing at the air, until he collapsed against the wall, panting with fury. It was after this that Elizabeth refused ever to be alone with him again. The court took notice. Wherever the queen went, there were eyes upon her and upon the prince. Now Carlos's conversations grew darker. In the gardens, in shadowed galleries, he would pose questions to foreign envoys. How had other kingdoms replaced an unfit king? What happened when God's favor was lost? His words might have been idle curiosity if not for the intensity in his stare. The way he seemed to weigh the answers as if fitting them into some secret design. If once his cruelty had been impulsive, now it was acquiring shape, calculation. The shadow he cast was lengthening, and it was beginning to fall across the king himself. The decision came quietly, though its execution would be anything but. Philip had listened long enough. 2 rumors, 2 coded reports, to his son's veiled questions about removing kings. A reckless prince might be dangerous, but a calculating one was intolerable. The order was simple: remove him from the stage. One winter night, the same armor that had once stormed a bedchamber was buckled once again onto the king's frame. Guards were summoned, not the ceremonial kind, but men who had fought in real wars, men loyal only to Philip. They moved through the palace like a shadow swallowing light. Carlos was taken to a tower room on the far side of the palace grounds, a place used more often for forgotten guests than heirs to the throne. It was furnished in princely fashion, a fine bed, a desk, a small hearth, but the windows were barred and the door locked from the outside. In the first weeks the prince raged. Servants reported hearing him hurl furniture against the walls, shouting accusations that the water was poisoned, that his food was laced with ground glass. He refused to bathe, claiming the steam carried demons. The fire in his hearth was allowed to go out more often than it was lit. Philip had given no explicit order to starve him, but deliveries of food became irregular, portions smaller, The king's intent was clear. Let time and confinement do what daggers could not. Soon the decline began. Without exercise, his muscles wasted. Sores bloomed on his skin, some oozing, some blackening. His hair, once thick, began to fall in clumps, leaving patches of scalp that wept and stank. The chamber pot often went untouched for days, the stench seeping into the stone. Guards rotated frequently. Few could endure the smell or the sounds for long, and then there were the voices. At first, the prince spoke to them in whispers, as if to invisible counselors. Later, he shouted, holding full audiences with shadows. One guard swore he saw a ring of rats gathered around the prince's chair, watching as he spoke, nodding as though they understood. In the margins of old palace records in a hand no one officially acknowledged are notes of a diary kept during his imprisonment. The first entries are coherent, complaining of the cold and the slow poison in his food. Then the writing grows jagged, the ink smeared as if by trembling hands. The last pages are not words at all, but dark stains and deep claw marks scored into the paper. By July, he could barely walk. His skin hung loose over sharp bones, his breath came in shallow gasps. On a final night, after hours of drifting between life and death, he opened his eyes with startling clarity. "Tell my father," he said, "that I forgive him." Whether this was mercy or the cruelest revenge, forcing Philip to live with the weight of those words, no one could say. Within hours, the prince was dead. But death was not the end of Philip's sentence. The king's scribes worked with the precision of inquisitors, erasing his son from the official record. Court chronicles skipped the years of Carlos's life, noting only that a sickly prince had died young. Servants who had tended him were reassigned to distant posts with strict orders never to speak his name. The tower room was sealed, its door chained and forgotten. Yet erasure is never perfect. Years later, during repairs to a chapel wall, workers discovered a hidden portrait. A young man with hollow eyes, wearing a crown of thorns. No artist's name, no date, but whispers claimed it was Carlos, painted during his captivity. In the Escorial monastery, a rumor persists of a coffin with no inscription, its lid bound in iron chains. And on storm-heavy nights, guards swear they hear footsteps pacing in the sealed tower. Slow, even, as though one leg were still shorter than the other. Philip had silenced his son, erased his shame, and preserved his empire. But the story of Don Carlos, the prince who rotted alive, would refuse to die.